Hello, everyone. Wishing you a wonderful day. Today, we're diving into a story where James is forced to choose between the family he was born into and the family he built. And one chilling message appears right after. You chose. Now watch what your choice costs. Stay with us to see what happens next. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next episode. Morning doesn't feel like morning in Diep's small living room. It feels like a checkpoint. Diep sits on the edge of the couch, phone in her hand, reading the same line again like it might change. Good girl. 2 words that don't sound violent, but land like a hand on the back of her neck. Nye is on the floor with her knees tucked up, hugging her worn bunny so tight the ears bend. She doesn't play. She listens. She watches the door. James stands near the window, shoulders tense, eyes scanning the street. Diep whispers, "We can't keep living like this." James nods once. "I know," he says, "so we won't." He crouches beside Nye. "Hey, look at me." Nye's big eyes lift. James brushes her hair back. "You're going to school today, like normal, and I'm going to be close, okay?" Nye's lips tremble. What if they won't, James says, steady. Because we're changing how we do everything. Diep hears his calm and feels both comfort and fear. Because it isn't denial. It's preparation. James checks his phone. Missed calls from unknown numbers, a message from an assistant, and then one name that makes his breath stall. Mother. Diep notices his pause. "Mrs. Huyen," James taps play. It's a short clip from a charity board meeting. Cameras, suits, polite applause, and there, at a podium, is Mrs. Huyen. Her posture is calm, her expression is gentle, but her words are not. "I want to make one thing clear," she says. "I support my son's choices. I support the family he has built, and I will not stay quiet while fear is used as control." Diep's hand flies to her mouth. James doesn't move. He just watches, eyes fixed, throat tight, like he's seeing his mother for the first time. The clip ends. A new text appears immediately after, from Mrs. Huyen. "Meet me. 30 minutes. Riverside Cafe. No security. Come alone. Only you and Diep." Diep looks up, alarmed. "No security?" James exhales slowly. That's the point. At the Riverside Cafe, James sits with his back to a wall, eyes checking the entrance, the windows, the street. Diep sits opposite him, forcing her breathing to stay even. Then she sees her. Mrs. Huyen walks in alone. No bodyguards, no entourage. She carries a small handbag. Her face is calm, but her eyes are tired. She pauses, taking them in. James's tension, Diep's pale face, the fear sitting between them. Then she sits. Diep's voice shakes. "Mrs. Huyen, your speech..." Mrs. Huyen lifts a hand gently. "I meant every word." James watches her closely. Dad's going to explode. Mrs. Huyen nods once. He already has. Diep swallows. "Why now?" Mrs. Huyen looks at James with steadiness that feels like truth. "Because silence didn't protect you," she says. "It only taught him he could keep going." James's jaw tightens. "He'll punish you." "He's punished me for years," Mrs. Huyen replies. Quietly, privately, carefully, so it looks like order instead of cruelty. Diep's eyes fill. "I'm sorry. For causing chaos?" Mrs. Huyen leans forward, voice soft but firm. "Stop apologizing for surviving." James asks, "What does he want?" Mrs. Huyen's gaze lowers for a moment, then lifts. "He believes your choice is betrayal," she says. "Not because you chose Diep, but because you chose yourself." James's fingers curl around his cup. "When his mother humiliated him, it broke something," Mrs. Hoan continues. He built his whole life to never feel small again. So, when anyone challenges him, he retaliates. He has to win. Diep whispers, "So this isn't about me." Mrs. Huyen nods slowly. "It's bigger than you. You're just the battlefield he picked." James's eyes darken. "Then I'll end it." Mrs. Huyen's voice is calm, almost warning. "You can't end him with anger. He feeds on that." James leans in. "Then how?" "You fight him like a man who finally understands something," she says. "Power only works when you keep begging for permission." James's throat tightens. "You're saying I have to choose." Mrs. Huyen doesn't flinch. He will force that choice today, in front of people. He wants you to feel ashamed. Diep's stomach drops. "Today?" Mrs. Huyen nods. "He called an executive meeting. He wants it to look like corporate necessity. Like you're unstable. Like she's a liability." She looks at Diep. He will try to isolate you." James's jaw clenches. "Not happening." Mrs. Huyen places a small envelope on the table. Inside is a printed schedule, a list of names, and one line circled, Mr. Hoan's conference room, 4 p.m. "I will go," Mrs. Huyen says, "and I will stand publicly this time." James's eyes flicker. "You're not afraid?" Mrs. Huyen smiles, small, sad. "I'm afraid, but I'm more afraid of what your life becomes if you learn the wrong lesson from my silence." Diep whispers, "What lesson?" Mrs. Huyen looks directly at James. "That staying quiet for love is still losing, and you don't have to be like me." James's chest rises, falls. Then, quietly, he says, "Okay." And Diep hears it, not as agreement but as a door opening. By 3:55 p.m., the Hoan family's headquarters feels like a glass fortress. The lobby is polished marble. The staff are too polite, and everyone senses something is coming. James walks in first. No hesitation. Diep follows, chin lifted, even though her hands tremble. Mrs. Huyen walks beside them, not behind anyone. Heads turn. Phones go still. Whispers start. Diep feels the weight of every stare, like each one is measuring her worth. James's fingers find hers, a quiet anchor. Mrs. Huyen doesn't look away from anyone. She simply walks forward, unhurried. That calm becomes a shield, one Mr. Hoan never learned to break, not with noise anyway. They reach the executive floor. The conference room doors are closed. 2 assistants stand near the entrance like guards pretending to be helpful. When James approaches, one of them says softly, "Mr. Hoan is waiting." James doesn't answer. He pushes the doors open. Mr. Hoan stands at the head of the long table, hands resting on the chair back like he owns the air. Executives sit along the sides, stiff and uncomfortable, eyes darting between James, Diep, and Mrs. Huyen. Mr. Hoan's gaze lands on Diep first, cold, then James, sharp, then Mrs. Huyen. For a split second, shock cracks through his control. He says her name like betrayal itself. "Huyen!" Mrs. Huyen sets her purse down calmly. "Hoan." Mr. Hoan's voice turns smooth. "So you've decided to join this?" Mrs. Huyen answers evenly. "I decided to stop lying with my silence." A ripple moves across the table. People shift. Mr. Hoan smiles thinly. You've benefited from my name for decades, and I've paid for it," Mrs. Huyen replies, "with decades of quiet." Mr. Hoan turns to James. "Then, let's end this." He nods toward Diep. "Bring her under control," he says, "or remove her from your life. Either way, my family does not become a joke." James steps forward. "She's not a joke. She's not a tool. She's my family." Mr. Hoan's eyes harden. "Family?" He opens a thick folder and slides it forward. "Here's family," he says, tapping pages. "Accounts, boards, assets, Names. Legacy. Diep's breath catches. Mr. Hoan leans in. You want to rebel? Fine. But rebellion doesn't get funded by my empire. Mrs. Huyen's voice cuts in, calm, precise. This isn't respect, Hoan, this is humiliation. Mr. Hoan's jaw tightens. Mrs. Huyen continues, each word a mirror held up in public. The more opposition you face, the more your true nature shows. You don't want obedience. You want surrender, because you're still trying to outrun the day your mother made you feel small. The room goes silent. Executives stare at the table like it suddenly became dangerous to look up. Mr. Hoan's voice drops low. Watch your words. Mrs. Huyen doesn't blink. I'm done watching my words. Mr. Hoan points at James, raising his voice so everyone hears. Then choose. Right now. His gaze is hard, deliberate. Are you my son, or are you hers? Diep flinches. The humiliation is aimed at James, but it cuts her too. James's heartbeat sounds loud in his own ears. Born family. Built family. He looks at Diep, eyes wet, but steady. Not begging, bracing. He looks at his mother, standing like a line drawn in the sand. And in Mrs. Huyen's eyes, James sees what he's waited his whole life for. Permission to stand up without apologizing. James turns back to Mr. Hoan. I'm your son, he says quietly. But I'm not your weapon. Mr. Hoan's nostrils flare. James continues, voice still calm. Diep is my family. Nye is my family. And if you force me to choose... He takes one step forward, out of shadow, into light. I choose the family I built. A sharp inhale moves through the room. Mr. Hoan's face changes, humiliation flooding in, turning into rage. He slams his palm on the table. Then, more dangerous than yelling, he smiles. You think you've won because you said it out loud, he says softly. But you forget something. James narrows his eyes. What? Mr. Hoan's voice is almost gentle. A family you built can be dismantled. Diep's breath stops. Mrs. Huyen's gaze sharpens. James doesn't flinch. He reaches into his jacket and places his access badge on the table. Small plastic, massive meaning. I'm done being controlled by what you can take from me? Mr. Hoan stares at it like it's a personal insult. James turns toward the door. Diep stands with him instantly. Mrs. Huyen picks up her purse. Together they walk out. 3 people moving as one. Behind them, Mr. Hoan calls, cold and precise. You walk out that door, James. And you walk out of everything I built for you. James doesn't turn around. Then I'll build something you can't own. In the hallway, the air feels like oxygen again. Diep's hands shake now that the adrenaline has nowhere to go. Mrs. Huyen pauses, her calm cracking just enough to show feeling. That was the first time you didn't soften yourself for him, she says to James. James swallows. Because I watched you do it. Mrs. Huyen leans closer, voice low. He will try to win back control using prestige, public image, reputation, money. He will try to pull one of us back, make it look like we returned, willingly. Diep whispers, what do we do? Mrs. Huyen looks at James. You stop treating this like a family argument. This is a power struggle. They step into the elevator. As the doors close, James's phone vibrates. Unknown number. You chose. Now watch what your choice costs. Diep's face goes pale. Mrs. Huyen closes her eyes for a second, like she expected it. James's voice is quiet. Not fear. War. Okay, he says. Then we change the game. The elevator descends. When it opens, James grips Diep's hand and dials a number he hasn't called in a long time. A man answers on the second ring. James? James speaks low. I need quiet help, the kind that doesn't announce itself. A pause. Then the voice says, Tell me where to start. James looks at Diep, then at his mother. And for the first time in days, Diep sees something in James's eyes that feels like oxygen. Not because the danger is gone, but because he finally knows which side he's on. And now, he's ready to protect it.
James và Diep bị dồn vào thế bí khi tài khoản bị xem xét. Hợp đồng lần theo dấu vết phát hiện một tài liệu nội bộ chỉ có chữ ký của Mr. Hoan, kèm ghi chú thực hiện ngoài quy trình. Đây là bằng chứng cho thấy ông đã can thiệp trái phép. James không kiện ngay mà gửi cho cha một email duy nhất. Anh đã bắt đầu tự bảo vệ mình. Phản ứng đến lập tức, tài khoản được mở lại nhưng hợp đồng bị xóa sổ. Thế cân bằng quyền lực bắt đầu thay đổi. James thừa nhận nỗi sợ nhưng quyết đứng lên để Di không